Welcome, gentlemen.
Oh, pleasure
Thank
to
you.
be here.
Welcome.
So glad to have you. Live Studio B sessions on WNCW are made possible by Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. We're so excited to have you here. You're playing tonight at the Orange Peel in Asheville and then over at the Bijou Theater in Knoxville the next night. Rod Argent, Colin Blunstone. So wonderful to have you in Spindale, North Carolina.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
You've been quite busy lately. You've got shows tonight, tomorrow. You'll be in the States twice this year, I think.
Twice this year, and last year, in the States alone, we had three 6-week tours. It's been really intense, but fantastic, because the reason we're doing this, I was speaking to Dennis before the show, the reason we're doing this is one reason only, and that is because we've got such a great kicking band, and we can get in front of that band every night and do all the old music and all the new music that we're writing as well.
So your current band, you've been playing together for 10 years, but you're also adding Pat Sansone to the shows tonight.
That's right. He's a wonderful singer-songwriter. We're out there every night listening to him. He's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
So tell us a little bit about some of your recent experiences. You were also on the Ultimate R&B tour in England with
Yes.
some great names.
Yeah, we were playing with the Animals and the Yardbirds, Maggie Bell and Dave Berry. They're all big names in the UK. I'm not sure if all of them had hits over here, but they're all wonderful performers. And it's one of those very happy shows. You know, we did about 6 weeks with them, and every night was just a joy. It was fantastic. And then we came from there, and we did the Moody Blues Cruise in the Caribbean. And the Moody's are a fabulous band, and Roger Daltrey from The Who was on the tour, and the Strawbs, and lots of wonderful acts. It's a huge liner, 100,000-ton liner, 5,000 guests, and 3,000 crew. It's quite a big thing, and we did it last year as well. It's great fun.
Well, tell us a little bit about, too, you've got, as opposed to the classic lineup of the Ultimate R&B Tour, you've also got a bunch of young acts that you're going to be playing with in Austin coming up in May at the Psych Fest.
Yeah.
So these are a lot of the edgier bands that we, like a station like ours, we might play late at night, like Black Angels, Primal Scream, and bands like that.
Well, we played last year at the South by Southwest Festival, and we were a bit worried about it, actually, because we thought, well, maybe nobody's going to turn up, no one's going to take any notice. But actually, it was amazing, and we had many young people in the audience coming to see us. On the last night, on our showcase night, we had Prince about 200 yards up the road. I thought, no one's going to come along at all. But it was packed. It was absolutely packed. And we got lots of coverage in the local papers, a big young component to the audience as well. So I feel much better about doing the Psych Fest this year because of that, I think.
I think some of that younger audience might be due to the sort of the lengthening shadow of Odyssey and Oracle, which just remains evergreen. It's
crazy, isn't it? I mean, that album came out, and then even with Time of the Season on it, which was a number one hit in most places in the world, it didn't really sell. And then 12 years later, people like in the UK, I know he's not such a big star here, but Paul Weller was enormous in the UK, and it still is, in fact. And he quoted it as being his favourite album. And then lots of young bands right up until the present day have done the same thing. And they make videos on the net explaining why, it sells more now than it did when it first came out. It's really crazy. And thank you, if anyone's listening, thank you very much for that. We're very, very grateful. But you're right. And it does draw in a proportion of young people along with, I'm not trying to push the fact that a lot of young people come. Sometimes they don't, but we play to a very mixed audience, which is fantastic. But that, having that young component and continuing component in the audience is something that's very nice for us.
But you've got a lot of great records that you've been putting out lately. I mean, just a couple of years ago, you brought us Breathe Out, Breathe In, and I'm assuming you're playing a lot of that music as well.
We are. We do 3 or 4 songs from that, and we try not to tax the audience too much, But we love to play 3 or 4 tracks from that particular album, and we've already started recording. We've recorded 2 tracks already for our next album as well.
Well, very good. We're live with the Zombies in Studio B on WNCW. Colin, you've been working a lot with a vocal trainer, keeping your voice up. Tell us how that's gone.
Well, it's gone really well. Rod and I both studied with a singing coach called Ian Adam, and mostly he trained singers for the theatre, what you would call Broadway, we would call the West End. And of course, they have to play every night, so their voices have to be strong and they have to be accurate. And so he teaches a technique that helps them to achieve that. And he doesn't try and change your voice. He just tries to make it stronger and more accurate. And as long as you keep doing the practice sessions, and I was up at the crack of dawn this morning. I feel sorry for my neighbours because I did half an hour's warm-up this morning. And then later on today before the show, I'll do half an hour before sound check, and then I do half an hour before the show. So that's an hour and a half of a singing lesson before we even do the show. But it really helps. It really helps.
Particularly when you're doing, like we've got 5 shows in a row, 5 hour-and-a-half shows in a row, or maybe a bit more than an hour and a half. And when you're 18 years old, you can get away with an awful lot. When you get older, I think you can make your instrument even better. But it's like an athlete; you have to work at it more, I think, as you get older.
So let's say a person that does not sing, I want to sing better. Are there any tips you can give me?
Yeah, well, there's a sort of a serious. I'll try and be serious because I often tell it as a joke, but it has rude words in it. So I think it might be a bit early in the day for the rude words. But I tell you, one of the most important things if you want to sing, because when you're singing in front of people, most people tense up. So you must remember to breathe. You have to take a breath before you sing, and don't let your shoulders go up. So you take a breath, but keep your shoulders down. And then hopefully your diaphragm here will rise. So as you take the breath, your diaphragm rises, and that should support your voice. And that will make a big difference to how you sing. I could tell you the full story, but you might get the station into trouble. So
but it's important to practice, though.
That's
you've got to do it every day, basically.
I tell you something else. You've got to really know the words to the song you're going to sing. That might sound a bit of a strange thing to say. I mean, I'm really bad at this. I make words up all the time. But if you're really, really sure and secure in the song you're going to sing, it helps. Most people, they sing in the shower and they know most of the song, roughly how it goes. You have to know that song really, really well, and that will help no end, yeah.
Wow. Rod, can you tell us about keyboards, because that's, front and center as well as the harmonies in the music of Zombies and all of the music that you performed. And I wanted to ask about how you were influenced in bringing keyboard to the front and how it's influenced so many other bands, because, thinking about the Invasion era and how that was very uncommon, really, to have keyboard, and especially some of the minor keys that you play.
Yeah, I guess it was. When we started out, when we had our very first rehearsal, I was supposed to be the lead singer, and it's the first time I'd ever met Colin. And it was only when I heard him sing on the first rehearsal, I said, "Oh, we've got to use you as lead voice. You've got such a distinctive voice. It's really lovely, And I, without any problem, I moved round a chair, and Colin actually heard me wander over to an old beaten up old piano, and I played Nut Rocker on the piano, the old B Bumble thing, and he came racing over to me and said, "That's amazing. You've got to play piano in the band." So we did. I thought, well, bands are guitar bands like this. This was 1961. Rock and roll is guitars, really, the way we were doing it. But anyway, we did move around to that. And very soon after that, the first electric piano that I came across that you could buy in the UK, which was a Hohner Pianet. It was a German piano called a Hohner Pianet. And I managed to get hold of one of those. And for the first time, I could be heard on stage. So I started to use that all the time. And the funny thing is, I was in love with rock and roll, but I was also equally in love with people like Miles Davis, as far as jazz is concerned. And I listened to a lot of classical music as well. And even when I had my first flush of infatuation with rock and roll, I didn't stop listening to those other guys. But I never thought I was playing any of it. But I think some of those influences found their way in anyway to the... as they did with many bands. I was talking to John Steele, the drummer with the Animals, on the last R&B tour that we did. And he said that when he was playing House of the Rising Sun, he imagined he was playing Walk on the Wild Side, the Jimmy Smith record. So a lot of that was flowing around the UK sort of musical consciousness around that time. So I wasn't the only one doing it. But I think some of those influences came in without me even thinking about it. Pat Metheny, many years later, told me that hearing She's Not There was one of the things that made him think he could do something within a rock format, rather than just purely jazz, a sort of rock fusion, jazz fusion format. So I reckon that did happen to some extent, and I'm very grateful for it. But it was a very natural progression. It wasn't anything self-conscious.
Have you been picking up any other influences along the way?
I guess you always do. I mean, the thing is, with me, it's more than genres of music. It's always been about individual people. The first time I heard, I hated pop music in the 50s. Then I heard Elvis sing Hound Dog, and that was the first raw rock and roll that I'd heard. And I still love his early, the first 3 years of Elvis's life. I think those records are transcendental. I mean, they're just wonderful. And then, I heard Miles Davis very soon after that, and was completely knocked out with him and his band at the time, around 58. First time I heard Cream, I was knocked out. First time I heard Police later on, I had an equivalent feeling, of this is something really special. So for me, it's been about individual people more than particular fashions or genres of music.
Well, you've had a really good week, because earlier this week you had the blue plaque. I think that was Sunday in St. Albans was erected for the spot that you've played your first performance.
Well, it is. There is a blue plaque on the corner, and it says in Easter 1961, the 5 original members of the Zombies met.
15 years old at the time.
15 years old, met here. So anyone who goes past that corner, and it's on the main street in St. Albans, where we all went to school in a place called St. Albans, they'll see that. So that was a real thrill.
For our first rehearsal, we met.
Yeah, that was where we met for our first rehearsal. We met out, it was a pub on the corner, and we met outside the pub because we were too young to go into the pub, so we had to stand on the corner. I didn't know Rod, and when I turned up, I used to do a lot of sport, and I played a lot of rugby, and when I turned up, I had a very badly broken nose and 2 black eyes, and I was strapped right across my face like this.
As we approached, I said, God, I hope it's not him.
They were all a bit worried. We could have named the band the Zombies right there.
Yeah, I think we
could,
really.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the name the Zombies are really all over culture now. It's very, very popular all of a sudden. But in 1961, I imagine it was more of what, comic book influence? What gave you the name?
Colin said he'd never heard of, he didn't know what a zombie was. I mean, I did, but just about. But there were no zombie films. The bass player suggested the name, and I loved it immediately. Colin hated it. I loved it because I thought, this is a name that no one else is going to have. It's got a vaguely sort of exotic influence. I mean, as I said, there were no zombie programs or films. I knew it was something to do with Haiti and the sort of magical resurrection of the dead and everything. As you know, I sort of knew that much. But I figured that when you think about the Beatles, you don't think about insects, or you don't even think about a play on words. You think about John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So if you're lucky enough to get known, then people very soon just start associating the name with the people in the band. And so that felt very good to me. I'll tell you a very quick story. On the first TV we ever did, it was Ready, Steady, Go. And one of the other acts on that show was Manfred Mann with 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which was a huge hit, their first really big hit. And I was wandering down the corridor after rehearsal, and I heard Sir Miles Davis playing in a dressing room. And as I've already said to you, I got very turned on to Miles around that time. And I walked in and said, "Excuse me, is that Miles playing?" He said, "Well, no, it isn't, but it's a record." You know, very funny joke. And it was Manfred Mann. And he said, "You're Rod Argent, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Man, I love your record." She's Not There, that was. He said, "But you've got to change that name." But we never did.
I'm glad you didn't. We're live with the Zombies in Studio B on WNCW this afternoon. I wanted to talk a little bit about the era from where those songs come from, the British invasion, and your take on it, because, you know, obviously being stateside, the memory, you know, I wasn't there in person, but the history of it is that, you know, hardly any bands from the States could, you know, see the light of day for about 6 or 8 years. And so it was pretty much the pop charts were dominated by British bands. But I wondered what it was like from the English point of view, because, you know, there's the the stories of a little bit of blowback, or I don't know what you would call it. Some people that may have resented some of the success of British bands, Chad and Jeremy or the Clash or whomever, that were maybe more popular stateside than they were in the UK and things like that.
Well, I mean, it was a strange time in the sense that really from the Beatles, I would say, because the Beatles hit the UK in a huge way in around 1962, and they came from Liverpool, which was a port, and a lot of American shipping came over, and they had access to a lot of what at the time in the US I believe were called sort of race records. But we had no such distinction. We were in love with the early Motown stuff we heard. We loved all the black blues that we were hearing, both urban and country blues. Country blues, which had, even by the black population over here, was regarded as being very old-fashioned, at that time. But all this was in a big melting pot, and we sort of drank this all in with those influences and recycled it with an English bent, if you like, and that went back to the States and filtered through the UK and went back as something that was just slightly different. And so it took a lot of people in the US by surprise, I think. But of course, America was nirvana for us. I mean, I first heard Elvis, as I've already said to you, when I was 11 years old, and it turned my world around. I mean, I thought it was the most... America was like a magic universe that had nothing to do with us at all. I mean, the cultures were very, very disparate in those times. I mean, much different than they are now from each other. And America and Elvis himself seemed like something like E.T., it's someone from another planet coming down to Earth. And then suddenly there we were, just a few years later, recycling this, not only doing that, but going to the States and in 1964, not only having a number one record in this magic land of rock and roll, but also in 1965, just a year later, we went up to Elvis's house, knocked on his door, and said, "Is Elvis in?" I mean, there was no security or anything. And I was telling this story years later to an Irish DJ, and he said to me that Elvis, he was an Elvis freak. He said Elvis not only knew who we were, because he wasn't in that day, unfortunately, but he had 3 of my songs, our records, on his jukebox. So just 9 years after, as a 19-year-old kid, I was at Elvis's house finding out that this magic being had our records on his jukebox. It was a dreamlike time.
And also, just to go back to your question, I don't think we ever felt any hostility from any bands that we were coming over and playing over here. It may have existed, but we didn't feel it at all. And we were just intrigued because for a large part of us, America was the place. This is where rock and roll came from. We were often, really, when we started off, we were just trying to imitate American artists.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. And so we would come over, and to a large extent, we were playing American songs to an American audience, but they were perceiving it as something new. And, it kind of intrigued us, but we couldn't fight it, could we, really? We although once we got going, certainly in our band, Rod and Chris White were writing our material. But when we started, and it's true of most British bands, they were playing American material, and they were trying to play it in the most American way they could.
But because it went through an English filter,
yeah, to you it sounded slightly different. Yeah. To us, it sounded as close as we could get it.
Yeah.
It's always fascinating to find out how things work, and the great strokes of luck that you've had as a band, and it goes both ways too, because say an artist like Jimi Hendrix, who was largely discovered in England, what would it have been like if he hadn't have gone to England?
Exactly, he wouldn't. I don't think he was regarded as wonderful when he came to the UK. And I remember hearing a story about Clapton and Pete Townsend sitting in the front row of the Marquee Club, small sort of R&B club in the UK, with wonder on their faces, and at one point they held each other's hand, and just looked at the stage and looked at each other and said, "All right, what are we going to do now?" Because they had such an impact on them.
I know that when you had started out, you had no, and of course, who can when they're young and they're just starting out? And in rock and roll, there was no real way of saying, I'm going to have a career in this in 1964. But along the way, you've kind of come and gone. And I know, Colin, you've gone outside of music, especially right after the Zombies. But then, luckily for everybody, you've come back into it, and everybody has been pretty steady ever since. Did you ever have that moment where you knew that this was viable, that you were like, okay, this is really where I'm going to be from here out?
Well, I think the first time it struck me, we won a really, really big rock competition just before we recorded She's Not There. And that was the first time I thought, because we'd only played locally, and we had a good fan base locally. And that was the first time I thought, so that was about 50 years ago now, right now. I thought, maybe there is a way ahead for us. But once we turned professional, I think Rod always knew he wanted to spend his lifetime, his whole career as a musician. I wasn't sure there was a place for someone like me, because the rules hadn't been written then. In some ways, we're writing the rules now. We were one of the first English bands to travel around the world, and we're writing the rules now. And there was no one ahead of us to say. And I kind of thought this is going to be a wonderful 2 or 3 years adventure, and then we'll get back to real life. And in a way, that almost happened, because when the band finished in 1967, the 3 non-writers, we hadn't made a lot of money on the road. Our advice, our advisors weren't that hip. And the 3 non-writers were totally broke. And so all 3 of us had to get jobs, and we got jobs outside of the business, which is what you were just referring to. But then within about a year, they couldn't keep us out. We were back in again. We were all recording or working for record companies or something.
I have to tell you that it's always made me chuckle, because even when we haven't been working together, we've stayed friends. And through the years, Colin's often said to me, I don't know, I've been thinking about, he's been thinking about other professions and things. And about 4 years ago, he said to me, do you know what? I think this is it. I think this is my profession.
So there's
We're just
answer.
coming up to 70 now. I suddenly realised, I think maybe this is it.
This is what I'll do when I grow up.
Yeah.
See, a few years ago, I would be looking at you and I'd be going, yeah, I'd like to do that. Maybe there's an opening, But I've given up now. I think this is it.
We'll let you try it out. Come on, any day. We'll let you sit in the booth. TheZombies.net is where you can find out about all things Rod Argent, Colin Blunstone, and the band. And we should mention something about the band, I think. So it's your cousin, Jim Rodford, is playing bass with his son. Is that right? Is the drummer.
It's a very family thing. And I particularly, right at the beginning, when I was 11 years old, and I told you about Elvis, but it was Jim that played me Elvis. He was already in a band, one of the first skiffle groups and then the first electric groups in the whole of the south of England. And I was transfixed when I went along and saw them play. And I thought, I have to be in a band someday. When the Zombies first formed in 1961, that first rehearsal we told you about, we asked Jim. He was the first person I asked to be in the band. He turned me down at that point because why should he? He was in a great local group. But years later, became founder member with me of Argent. After Argent, for 18 years on their biggest ever selling albums in America, he was bass player with the Kinks. He played with Lonnie Donegan for a while. He's a bit of a legend. He's played with many legendary jazz and blues people as well as those bands that I've just mentioned. So that's my cousin. His son, as you so rightly said, brilliant drummer, Steve, absolutely great drummer on drums. And a guitarist we've only had with us for the last 3 or 4 years called Tom Toomey, who is not only a great electric player, but a wonderful acoustic player as well. So that's added another dimension. It really is a hot band, and that is why we have such a great time playing night after night. And that moment on the stage, sometimes the 6 and 7 hour travelling every day gets very, very tedious. But you remember why you're doing it when you step onto that stage at night.
Well, they're playing live at the Orange Peel in Asheville tonight, Bijou Theater in Knoxville tomorrow night, and then heading off to Atlanta, I think.
Yeah, and Athens, and
all on their website.
It's all a Southern States tour.
Live from the Zombies in Studio B on WNCW Spindale, WSIF Wilkesboro. Rod, Colin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Live Studio B sessions on WNCW are made possible by Sierra Nevada Brewing Company.